Be the envy of the neighborhood. 860 KKAT, where the grass is always greener. Welcome to Gardening Utah. Here's composter and show hoster, Jana Francis.
Welcome to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis. Every week here on Gardening Utah, we give you gardening inspiration and advice from experts across the state. We talk about vegetables, flowers, trees, shrubs, and of course, your lawn. Thank you for listening. I hope this show is something that you'll look forward to checking in with every week. Whether you're a beginner or an expert, Gardening Utah aims to inspire you and keep you in the know of what tasks you should be accomplishing in your yard and meet amazing, informative experts along the way. This show airs on the radio on the weekends here in Utah at 10 a.m. on 860 AM KKAT, and episodes drop every weekend on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, so hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. On today's show, we're going to be tackling a topic that we've never talked about on this show. We're going to be talking about native plants. So Cameron Alcott with Progressive Plants is with me co-hosting today, and our guest is Steven Paulsen from Native Roots. And Native Roots specializes in native plants and all that comes with them. And they have two lines of plant material that they work with. They have a branded line of selected native plants for residential and commercial applications. And they also have genetically diverse native plant and seed offerings. So you can find out more about them at native-roots.net, but they have thousands of different species. And we're going to be speaking with Steven Paulsen today and have such an interesting conversation on the benefits of native plants, on how it can create such diversity in your yard and garden. And I really, really enjoyed our conversation. But first, the tip of the week.
860 KKAT with your Gardening Utah tip of the week.
My tip of the week is how to make that Christmas tree last all season and stay fresh. The most important thing to keep in mind is you do not want the tree to ever dry out. Now, there are several things you can do to make sure this doesn't happen. First and foremost is every tree needs a fresh cut on the bottom right before you place it in the water, and no more than 1 hour before being placed in the water. So, most Christmas tree places or lots will cut off the bottom for you when you buy your tree. However, if you're cutting it down from somewhere afar, you're going to want to do a fresh cut when you will get home. Now, place your tree in the stand as soon as possible upon arriving home. And the trick here is to fill the stand with warm water. Now, what the warm water does is it helps break down the sap and it allows the tree to intake more water. Make sure to keep your tree away from heat sources and check the stand every single day, especially at the beginning. You never want to let that bowl run out of water, and fresh cut trees are very thirsty. Now, last but not least, enjoy that beautiful tree.
And that's your Gardening Utah tip of the week, brought to you by The Advocates. If you're in an accident, you deserve an advocate. Call 801-355-5550 or visit utahadvocates.com. Never miss a tip for your garden and never miss an episode. The Gardening Utah Podcast with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT.
Well, Cameron, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Jana. How are you doing?
I'm good. It's long time no see, except for last weekend.
I know, right? Was that not the best thing that you've ever seen?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that was really, really cool. So for the listeners, last Saturday night, Cameron and I and our significant others went out to the Utah Utes game and had a blast. And we actually went to Cameron's girlfriend's house to pick them up. And let me tell you what, I got to see all of Mandy's beautiful, beautiful trees and shrubs. And it was like so obvious that like, oh, someone from Progressive Plants lives there. Or you know what I mean? It was so
well, I don't live there.
Well, that's true.
But
right.
I do utilize her land to experiment with like plants that aren't even on the market yet. So
yeah, I guess what I should have said is somebody knows somebody in the plant world in that house.
Yeah, that was, it's a lot of fun because you get to play with like little combinations and stuff like that. So it's like a really cool, creative outlet, especially when I don't have any pressure. You know, I do what I want and see what works. Because sometimes if you're designing for like a client, then you start wondering, like, oh, wow, is this person going to like it? Is it going to be the right, flow, right color to capture everything that they want, so, but it's just a space that you have free reign with. It is just so much easier in some respects.
Yeah. Oh, I bet. Well, it was so pretty. I just loved all the different textures and even the potted peach, dwarf peach on the front porch.
I know, it's that little miniature peach that is there. It has a name.
Okay.
We named it Georgia.
Oh, I see what you did
Georgia
there.
peach.
Yep. That's cute. Yeah.
So,
but yeah, we had a good time. I got to see, what Cameron would do with a playground of plants. It was really, really neat to see. And I can't wait to get started on mine. In fact,
yeah, we need to figure that out.
Actually, I probably can come out to the nursery tomorrow.
Please do.
Okay. We're like making plans right here on the show. So you listeners, you've probably heard us for quite some time talking about how I have this big project that I've got to do at my house. And I think I'm going to get a kickstart on a lot of it coming up soon here, and buy some serious plant material from Cameron. And because it's the best time to plant right now. I wouldn't say the best time, but it is pretty darn close, right?
It's still a really good time. I mean, anytime that you can plant while something's dormant, you are doing yourself a favor, big time. So the farther that you plant from the following summer, the better off that your plants are going to be, because they're going to have all that time to get their roots under them, to find all the water that they need, and they will perform so much better the following year if you can get it in now.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't mind going out and hand watering, like I know I'll have to do with several things, but who cares? I mean, it'll be worth it in the long run.
That's true.
And I can't wait.
Very
I can't
true.
wait to get started. So today, Cameron, today's show, we're going to talk a little bit about the mental health benefits of just getting your hands dirty and gardening, right?
Oh, yeah. Because that podcast that you sent me the other day, like I sat through the 3.5 hours straight because it was so unbelievably fascinating to me. And I just I might just go watch it again after we do this, because I was blindsided by how awesome that was.
It was so inspirational. So what it was is I happened to watch or listen to Jewel, the musician. She was on the Joe Rogan podcast. And at first I thought, oh my gosh, this is a 3 hour and 45-minute podcast. That is a big commitment. But I plugged away at it over a couple of days, just as I was, tinkering around the yard and doing chores and whatnot. But I was so freaking inspired by this podcast that did address, quite a bit of the mental health benefits of, I wouldn't even necessarily say gardening in that case, but just being connected to nature. And it was a lot about mental health, but it was also just super inspiring. So I sent it over to Cameron, and then we just decided to kind of tackle that topic today.
She's more than just gardening puns and sage advice. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT. Gardening Utah, available wherever you get your podcasts and at 860kkat.com/garden. Here's Jana Francis.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis, and with me here is Cameron Alcott with Progressive Plants. And today we have special guest, Steven Paulsen with Native Roots. Thank you so much for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So tell us a little bit about yourself and your company.
Well, so I'm a long-term wildland restoration ecologist that has a lot of experience restoring arid, dry areas all over the Western United States. And as a result, we ended up starting a native plant company, growing native plants for those restoration applications. And that turned into a unique opportunity with the University of Idaho and all of Dr. Steven Love's work. And so we ended up licensing Dr. Steven Love's work out of the Aberdeen Research Center, and subsequently have a branded and trademarked line of native plants that are specifically selected for applications in and around commercial and residential settings. And so we're pretty unique in that regard. Yeah, who knew?
That is awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really kind of interesting because when did we first meet, Steven? Like 3-4 years ago?
Yeah,
something like that. I want to say it was like at one of our trade shows or something. But the one thing that kind of fascinated me about what you were doing was like the development of a lot of native, plants, because it just seems like natives were something that were kind of shied away from in landscape for a long time because they were too wild or too unpredictable. The genetics were too diverse. And so, it just didn't really seem to like really fit with horticulture. So like, to me, plant genetics is like absolutely fascinating. It's like one of my favorite things to kind of study. So like, what made you really start to work with, selecting a lot of these natives? Like what was it about it that just kind of made you want to take on that challenge?
Yeah. So it's a great question. And it's a really straightforward answer that the market drove it. So our client base was eager always to transition native plants into residential settings, right? People go and experience their sense of place wherever they are, and they want to incorporate that sense of place in and around their home. And so as a restoration company, we were growing literally millions of plants that were suited and fit for wildland restorations, but they didn't work well when they were translated into people's front yards, right? Because of that inherent genetic diversity that those plants exhibit, you would have the same species of plant, and it would exhibit all sorts of different traits. So you'd have 10 plants going in a planter, say sticky geranium, and you would have one of those that would bloom for a week, and one that would bloom for a month, and one that would grow 6 inches tall, and one that would grow 2.5 feet tall. Very unpredictable. And so our clients for a time were frustrated with native plant applications like you had alluded to. They over time kind of built this reputation for being something cool, but were very difficult to apply. And with Dr. Love's work out of the Aberdeen Research Center and the genetic narrowing that he had put forward, we finally had an application that we could sell as a reliable inclusion in traditionally landscaped applications. And so it just really worked.
Yeah, I thought there was just like stuff that was just absolutely fascinating. I mean, I remember, going up to your place a couple of years ago and seeing like those, were they heucheras or heucherellas or something like that?
Yeah, Heuchera pucella, the Sandia.
Yeah, that's what it was.
Man, those things are like over the top cool. They get used all the time in hybridization for, traditional horticultural, heuchera applications, right? So there are companies that have taken that and crossbred it and hybridized it and done all kinds of crazy, fun, fantastic things with it. But the reality is I'm kind of a purist on my own account, and that plant speaks volumes all on its own account. It just doesn't need all that extra work, not to mention the pollinators and all the interactions that happen in functional habitats when you start to play with the genetics of plants rather than just have a pure form of a plant. It's just, this is the native version of it. It just happens to be what we have selected as the pinnacle of its performance. It's the best plant we could find, and we can repeat it again and again and again and create some consistency with it so that folks can use it.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up like the pollinators, because one of the things that I've noticed is, and I don't know where this is really coming from, but I've noticed like a really large push into working with designers or landscape architects to try to bring some of the natives back into the functional landscapes, because by a lot of times we're introducing a lot of ornamentals, we're also depriving a lot of native species from their food sources. And so how much work are you putting into like specific varieties that you have to kind of like help like some of the native pollinators in the Intermountain West? Are there any plants that you are working with specifically to try to make them more attractive to the ornamental landscape that will also help like a lot of the native species?
Absolutely. So the forb palette, the flowering plants that we have available to us in the arid West are in the thousands. Literally, there are several thousand species of flowering plants that are gorgeous for landscape. So if it's a flowering plant, just by its own nature, it's inherent that it wants to be and is utilized by pollinators, all sorts. And as a result, we've focused on the more charismatic species, right? So we want the big poppers, the big ones that stand out and make people excited about, wow, that's a big flower. And it's totally beautiful. And we really want that to be part of our landscape, right? So we focused on, it's easier probably to speak to genre than it is to speak to individual plants, but the penstemons at large, for instance, are a huge group that have a ton of potential that's completely underutilized. The buckwheats, again, buckwheats are exceedingly difficult for traditional horticultural programs to incorporate because they're hard to grow for all sorts of reasons. But we've created some predictability in the model and have a better application now. We have buckwheats that work and are awesome, and that's what we are after. Along with that, it's innumerable. We have all kinds of different places to go with it, and the shrubs as well. So, Amelanchier or serviceberry is a brilliant shrub, right? We've seen it in industry for a long time, but there's not at least in my humble opinion, there's not a real functional dwarf variety. Well, we happen to find one in Utah that's a naturalized dwarf, and we can actually repeat it. It's actually seed stable, and it might even be its own separate species. It hasn't been delineated as such, but we are trademarking and patenting plants like that, because who wouldn't want a very prolific flowering, wonderful fruit-bearing serviceberry that you could plant next to a foundation around a home kind of thing, right? So all of those things, back to point with pollinators, really work out. Not much of what we work with in native plants is anything but a benefit for native pollinators.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, didn't we have some serviceberry beer when we were hanging out at your place out there?
Yeah. So it turns out brewing all sorts of plants is awesome, right?
So let me guess, your primary business is doing like the genetically stable natives, and then you also take some of those and then you try to figure out what makes a good beer with it.
Yeah. At one point in time, we actually had a business wrapped around that. We ended up selling off that business and the recipes that went with it, and they've subsequently gone down the road and done some good things. Far and away better brewers than I could ever hope for. But yeah, I mean, the bottom line is we actually have some large seeded grasses, native grasses, that lend themselves to brewing as well. So I mean, if you're willing to dabble, you can get out there a long ways in the native space. There's a long and sordid history of fun things to do. Ethnobotany has no bounds, really.
Yeah, it's really cool. So what kind of plants have you been introducing like into the marketplace? What's really performed well for you commercially, like at the retail nurseries? I mean, I know that some of the Hymenopsis or like Sundancer daisies, I guess is what they're called. Yeah. I know those have been really popular here for us. Richardson's penstemon, I was actually really impressed with when I was able to mess one of those. But what are some of the ones that you're seeing pretty good success with?
So Penstemon kunthii is a really good one. The heuchera that we previously spoke about has been just a super duper plant. People love that one because it takes full sun and no water, and it's a heuchera. Like,
wow.
Yeah, right. Who would have thought? We have a Campanula rotundiflora, a bluebell that was sourced from the Black Hills in Wyoming. That's actually a thrice blooming bluebell. So it has 3 specific bloom periods inside of the year, and it will take full sun and low water. Just a spectacular thing. It's kind of in that space, it's interesting, the potential of the plant, because you talk to people about bluebells and you wouldn't necessarily think to yourself, yeah, here's a plant we can stick in a full sun street side, planting and expect it to perform. Ours does really well and does really good things. Trying to think of some of the other bits that we have out there. There's just a lot, hundreds actually of species that we've been slowly dabbling into the market space.
Yeah, it's been so fascinating to me to see like how much influence the natives are kind of come back into it, because like my history goes back to a company called Native Plants Incorporated. I mean, granted, I was 5 at the time when it existed, but my parents worked there, and so I mean, I got exposed to like a lot of the different natives and their landscape uses, and then they just kind of fell off the market because nobody was producing them or anything like that at all. So to me, like, it's really kind of amazing that you have been able to pick up the torch and kind of run with this a little bit and really focus on those perennials that work out here in these areas. So that's cool.
It is cool. Thanks for acknowledging it, because sometimes that is a heavy torch.
It is.
I believe
well,
it.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, people don't really think about like, oh, well, natives, I don't want my house to look like the West Desert, and the thing with horticulture is that you can start selecting for the traits that you want. So if you find a longer blooming spiralcia, which everybody wants when it's blooming, then that gives it an ornamental value for the landscape, and also will work with like the pollinators as well.
Absolutely.
And we'll be right back after this on Gardening Utah. Stay with us.
860 KKAT with Jana Francis and Gardening Utah, where it's always mulch time. She really does have the nicest yard on the block. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis, and with me here today is Cameron Alcott with Progressive Plants, and we've got Steve Paulsen today with Native Roots, and we're having the coolest conversation on native plants. I am so fascinated by this conversation so far, and what you're making me think of as we're talking about native plants and just kind of thinking about them so deeply is, really native plants have such a symbiotic relationship with native wildlife. Talk to me a little bit about the importance of that.
Oh, wow. Well, so the interactions between functional habitats, right, in urban settings, and charismatic megafauna, i.e. butterflies, deer,
Yeah.
all of those players, right? So the interactions are many, but I think what we've discovered over time is that as we create spaces with plants that are working inside of their natural environment, even in an urban space, we start to get inclusions or participation from wildlife that we wouldn't have otherwise enjoyed. And sometimes people shun that idea. They think of it like, a lot of folks don't want deer or elk eating their front yard.
Yeah.
Well, the reality is the deer and the elk actually respond quite well to native plants in your front yard. They may, if they are in the area, they may utilize some of those plants, but they generally don't abuse them because they don't come across as cotton candy to them. Your roses are probably more interesting than say Indian ricegrass in your front landscape. Both very beautiful plants and have a lot of applications, but you see what I'm getting at there. In addition to that, you start to be able to experience your landscape and enjoy that sense of place that comes with the idea of having native butterflies and the myriad of bees and acyllid flies and all the fun contributors that come with that be part of your landscape. So they come into it and you get to enjoy that and actually start to learn from it if you're willing to participate, right? So it becomes something more than just a painting that you look at. It's more of a painting that you live in. And that's a fun way to look at it.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. And, I really agree with you, because I think a lot of times when we historically, as we've landscaped yards, we're looking at like, oh, this is just for like our enjoyment and nothing more. It's our experience. And then we get very protective of it, and so then we don't want the deer to come in, or we don't want the different types of wildlife. But the reality is that a lot of like these natives, they can be absolutely beautiful. Like one of the natives that I love that's a little bit farther south is Shepherdea rotundifolia. Can't remember what the common name is, but it's beautiful. I think it's like the round leaf buffalo berry.
Yes,
is what it is.
Yes.
I think it's absolutely gorgeous, but the funny thing is when you were talking about how wildlife can kind of like, participate in your landscape, I have noticed that here at the nursery, I'll get animals in here and they'll go after some of the ornamentals and just like decimate them. Like they just chow down on them, like, like you said, cotton candy. But like, if you are very smart about some of the plants that you use, they're just kind of like browse shrubs where things will get nibbled on a little bit, but not like destroyed. And then the following growing season, they bounce back and they look absolutely amazing. And so I think that you're right. There needs to be like some sort of balance to what we use ornamentally as well as with the natives in our living spaces, and I think that's what you're doing is amazing. And I really just can't wait to see like how much this develops over the next coming years. And so the question that I have for you is like, what are your next goals with like native roots and working with the genetics the way that you've been working with them?
Well, pretty straightforward there too. So the whole idea as we move forward is to try and get native roots plants on retail shelves. So currently, we don't have a lot of retail outlets for native plants carrying the native roots trademark line. And we would like to see a shift in that. The way to do that is to have folks that are interested start calling them out and asking for them and having a desire to obtain them. It's, getting in front of a traditional horticultural market is really an interesting thing, right? It's a cart and horse problem for purveyors of plants. The big challenge we have and have always had is educating the buying public around what plants they actually want. And so, they would love to have some of the things we've spoken about today. There's just no question. The plants sell themselves, right? The problem is people are not familiar enough with the plant palettes to know what to even ask for. And I think that's why these venues are so important. We're passing around names and talking about things, and maybe people take interest and start to say, hey, I heard about native roots plants. That'd be interesting. I'd like to talk about it more in their local garden center.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because like one of the issues that we have around here a lot of times is, like with our local like Red Butte garden and the conservation garden, people go and they look at the plants and they're like, oh, wow, these are really cool. But these are plants that were picked by plant nerds, and we get them because they're cool, not because they're easy to grow in a commercial setting. So, it makes it kind of difficult. So, we get asked all the time, well, how come you don't have the plants that the conservation garden has? I'm like, well, have you tried to grow 1,000 of them before?
Right.
You'll get like 5 that take, so it gets kind of interesting sometimes. And so that's why I again, just get really interested in what you're doing with like some of the natives and, propagation, because that's really like always been my true passion when it comes to the nursery setting, as I sit behind a desk doing podcasts with Jana. So it kind of fascinates me with like, just what you're doing and stuff with the natives. So, and Jana, I'm sorry, I've been monopolizing all the time. I'm going to let you talk now.
What? No way. I love it. Hey, we're just all having a lovely conversation about native plants. And Steven, you said, I'm never going to forget this quote. I am going to use this over and over. I'm going to post this online in relation to this episode. When you said it's more than a painting you look at, but rather a painting you live in, that is just, yeah.
You need to trademark that right now.
Like I'm just imagining the birds and the butterflies and the flowers and oh my gosh, all the pollinators.
Like Snow White.
Right? That's exactly what I'm thinking of. Okay, well, we're going to come back and talk more native plants right after this on Gardening Utah. Stay with us.
She's more than just gardening puns and sage advice. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT. 860 KKAT with more of the fastest growing show on radio. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis. And today we're having a lovely conversation about native plants with Cameron Alcott with Progressive Plants and Steven Paulsen with Native Roots. And, as you're talking, I'm realizing that planting native plants where we live can define such a unique sense of place and heritage for our gardens and our yards, while also preserving kind of the natural history of like the flora and fauna of our region. And, I'm really super inspired right now, but I wanted to ask the question, and this is just a very, very basic question, back to the roots, no pun intended, but what makes a plant classified as a native?
Oh boy, you opened a can of worms with that.
We're getting into taxonomy and all this type of stuff. We're going to be here. We don't have the time.
Yeah, that falls back into categories that were introduced a long time ago to me by a very good friend and very good botanist, but lumpers and splitters, right? In the plant taxonomy world. So the short answer that I put forward is plants that were historically known from an area pre-settlement, which is an interesting conundrum, given that how would we know they were there pre-settlement? Because once we were there, wasn't it settled anyway?
Right.
Yeah, the questions keep coming, but the long and the short is we use as much of our botanical capability and cryptic botany, as it were, to kind of decipher what is and isn't a true blue native. There are a lot of different definitions put forward in that space, but I think suffice it to say, some of the things to be mindful of or cautious about in that conversation are words that get utilized like naturalized natives, or endemic inclusions. And so there are things that people need to be mindful of, when it comes to, is it a true blue native? For instance, probably one of the most omnipresent plants in the Intermountain West landscape would be crested wheatgrass, right? And crested wheatgrass found its origins in large part post the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl as a means of maintaining soil in place and having something grow there, coming off that large drought. But it's not a native plant. We put it there, but it's now, as previously mentioned, omnipresent. It's so present in the landscape that people often just qualify it as a native plant. And in fact, at one point, I believe, and I could be off on this, but I believe the state of Nevada at one point actually tried to vote it in as a native plant. So it's kind of interesting how humans kind of force themselves into the conversation, but the science would have you believe that if they're prior to settlement, then we can qualify it as native. How's that for a windy explanation?
Honestly, like I thought that you were going to use like the Russian olive or the Siberian elm. I thought that was the example that you were going to go for as a naturalized endemic species. So,
yeah. Oh, it happens. People all the time. Aren't Russian olives native? No, it's in the
no.
It's in the name.
It's in the name.
What about the Siberian elm?
Right, exactly. No. or Siberian pea shrub. We get that a lot.
Yeah.
And the irony, just to fill that out, the irony of those plants is many of them were introduced by our government as a means of habitat, improvement projects and functionality, right? So soil stabilization, windbreaks, that sort of thing. Those plants actually serve a purpose in that context, but they are not native. And so they are, however, often reliable. Not necessarily for any of the other players in a native landscape, but they do serve the purpose that they were put there for, right? If you want a hedgerow and you don't have a lot of water, Siberian pea shrub, for instance, might be a good option for you.
Yeah, pea shrubs are pretty interesting. There's the globe one that we kind of joke around here as the Park City boxwood, because it's really short and it's round, and it's you can hedge it like a boxwood hedge. It just grows up in Park City. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. So on how that kind of works out. So like Steven, here we're like in Salt Lake, they say we're like a zone 7. If you go to the USDA, you'd have to listen to other episodes of why we kind of talk about how the USDA zone map is a lie. Really, we're a zone 5. If you wanted to go by all the numbers and stuff like that. So like out of your native roots line, like what should people kind of be looking for that would be kind of successful along the Wasatch Front, maybe up on the benches a little bit? I know we talked a little bit about some of the penstemons because that's such a huge genus. Right. But what are some of the other ones that you would suggest for like our hot, dry, clay, high salt content soils that we have?
Oh, wow. So, well, certainly right out of the gate, again, the buckwheats fit the bill most of the time. We have a Badland mule's ear that is a really good plant. And so I don't know, there are a lot. Our Datura is another one that would probably do well in that space. And we have a really fun selection of that.
Ooh, wait, don't we call that the cow killer?
Yes. Some people, or the friendly hallucination pod, but yeah, there's all kinds of ethnobotany tied to all these plants wherever they come from. But so those are some good players. And then we have some really fun selections in the POA world. We actually have an Indian ricegrass. We have several Idaho fescue selections that are really fun that would actually, believe it or not, grow well in those dry, arid settings in saline soils, which I know might be a surprise, but we've tested it and vetted it and they work. So
yeah, that's interesting because usually fescues are like one of the first plants that I kind of throw out the window of like, right. I don't use them below 6,000 feet, Yeah. So that's interesting. Huh.
Yeah, we've had no issues with them and great success everywhere from, Colorado Front Range all the way up over the mountains, clean into Utah. So, we've had some really fun experimentation with these things in a breadth and width of area geographically that is really kind of special at this point. And you'd have to look into our website and that sort of thing to actually drill into that. I don't think we have time to get to all of it here, but
of course,
yeah, we've looked at these things upside down and sideways all over the place. And I think in large part, what we aimed to do was create a plant palette that could be used in a broader spectrum of application areas. So exposure, north, south, east, west exposure and elevation are all accommodated for in our selection process. We want them to potentially have a range expansion, but still be qualified as native.
So I got another kind of like a breeding question for you. So last time we talked, when I was up at your place, you were working on an Araucaria that had like a very low germination rate.
Yeah, super cool.
Yes. So now my question was this, because it occurred to me, and I can't remember if we talked about it or not. But I was like, okay, so you're developing a plant that's normally a weed by turning it into not a weed, but you can't really propagate it vegetatively. So you have to get it to go to seed, but the seeds don't germinate. How do you bring that to market?
That's a great question. So what we've done is we've actually gotten ourselves into a space with that particular plant. So for people that might not know, Araucaria is rabbit brush, right? And what we've done with that particular plant is we have enough of a propagation center. So we farm enough of it effectively to be able to harvest and clean enough seed to open sow. And when we open sow that plant, we actually get enough germination to accommodate, 10,000 units. It's laborious. It's not fun, and it's not for the faint of heart, but it is doable.
Yeah, that's, because I just think about like how fast like things have to turn in the nursery setting, sure. And I was just like, wow, because like some of the stuff that you do, I know it's a labor of love. It's not because it's going to be insanely profitable. Right. So I just wanted to know where you were at with that, because I just remember seeing that, thinking like, oh man, that's crazy talk.
It is kind of crazy, but I would say this. So there are sometimes the reach is worth it. In the space of rabbit brush, for instance, it's one of the latest blooming pollinator sinks that we have.
Right.
As a native plant in the arid West. And so imagine that you have a dwarf plant that's a prolific bloomer, doesn't turn into a weedy bugger, and actually has some really good silver foliage the year to enjoy. That's awesome, right? Like those are things that we look for. That one, the juice is worth the proverbial squeeze, because it's actually that sweet. It's really that worth it.
Right.
Some plants don't get there, but that one does.
Yeah, that's really cool. Okay, so the one other thing I want to talk to you about, because so Douglas fir, it's one of my favorite trees that are out there. You know where I'm going with this, don't you?
Oh man, dude.
Okay, so Doug firs, they're great. They're up in the mountains here. I've seen them like up at Snowbird. This is a tree that gets like 40, 50, 60 feet tall. Last time I was at your place, you had some Douglas fir in a 5-gallon bucket that was like 18 inches tall.
Yeah.
Tell me about those. I think this, to me, it's just fascinating.
So that was from a unique project that was source collected at I want to say 11 to 12,000 feet in elevation. And there was one or two mother trees on this property in particular. And that's how we found them. They were unique on their own account, just based on where they were and what they were doing naturally, all on their own.
Which is like 3,000 feet above their highest elevation recorded anywhere else.
Yeah, it's like ridiculous.
Yeah.
And that's why it was so specific, right? That's why the client came at us and said, hey, please propagate these so we can go back in and do some restoration with them. So that's what we did.
I can't believe we're out of time on this episode. I can't thank you enough for being here today, Steven. This has been so fun. How can our listeners find your company?
native-roots.net.
Well, thanks so much for being here on Gardening Utah, and we'll see all you guys next week.
When you're ready to grow big or go home, make your neighbors green with envy. Get the Gardening in Utah podcast, Gardening Utah. Available wherever you get your podcasts and at 860kkat.com/garden.